Welcome to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. Each week, we'll break down Israel's biggest stories, take a closer look at the events shaping the region, and take you inside the events that matter the most. This week opened with political friction in the Knesset as the death penalty for terrorist bill passed its first legal hurdle. This tension expanded to Damascus, where Syria ruled out joining the Abraham Accords, while suggesting that Trump could still shape negotiations. And it also continued in Gaza, where the IDF revealed new documents detailing Hamas's ties to Iran, UNRWA, and stolen aid. We'll also look at Trump's official request that President Isaac Herzog pardon Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a move that jolted Israeli politics and raised questions about law, leadership, and alliance. And then the deepest dive. After 11 years, Hamas has finally returned deceased hostage Lieutenant Hadar Goldin. His burial this week closes one chapter and exposes those that have never fully healed. Let's begin with this week's top stories. Shifra, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I think the first story that comes to mind from this week was the death penalty for terrorists bill passed its first legal hurdle this week. It was a very late night vote. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir has been pushing for this for a very long time, sometimes against the wants of the coalition of the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the vote passed. People were celebrating. Ben-Gvir was going around with a tray of baklava. There's a bunch of good photos of it. Obviously, it's not finalized, but this is the first step of, a few steps to make it actual law. So this has been an eternal debate for a very long time. I would also say before the war, but especially after October 7th, when, we now have prisons filled with these Nukhba terrorists who took part in the massacre. So yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think there's sort of two sides to it. On the one hand, I think that, the people who are supporting it, they do see October 7th as more of a push to sort of say, okay, not only are the terrorists who did October 7th now sitting in those prisons, but the fact that, hostages are such a prominent thing in warfare right now and prisoner exchanges for hostages. I've heard the argument a lot where it says, if there aren't any prisoners in the prisons, then there's no prisoners to exchange. However, you have to be really careful with that. And I think this is where criticism comes into it. How do you define somebody that has done an act of terror? And how do you define whether or not they are going to be given the death penalty? Because eventually,
Right.
That can just snowball into
the whole thing with legal precedent.
Exactly. So I think that is kind of what I've been hearing and what the concerns are and the worries are. And also in general, the death penalty in Israel is something that has only been done once. So
Right.
It's kind of always been a point of contention. And I think bringing it up again is always going to have people, feeling quite passionate on both sides.
Those fine details are really the important factor there. Because as you said, it's only been used once. So the hope would be that if this is going to be in law in Israel, it has to be for very, very specific occasions, crossing every T, dotting every I, not making sure that this is a loose, generic term because the legal precedents could, set. I will say that I'm not surprised at the timing of this, because another debate that was kind of going on throughout the war is that, we know that every time conditions got worse for prisoners or there were threats that conditions would get for prisoners, hostages would suffer abuse and that they would threaten the hostages. And, obviously at the time of filming right now, we still have the bodies of 4 hostages who remain in Gaza, and we're still waiting for their return. We're waiting for Hamas to upend their part of the agreement. But there was a concern that while we still had live hostages, if this bill passed, this will lead to, catastrophic results. So I just want to add that I think the timing isn't coincidental now that I feel like now that the government is in a space where I'd say at least that threat is taken off the table, they saw this now as the right time to bring it up. But, obviously it has more ways to go, and I guess we'll see how it develops.
It's interesting also because Ben-Gvir has been somebody who made a lot of comments during the war, and the hostages who came back themselves said that his comments directly affected their situation. So, I think it just goes to prove that that concern was real and valid.
Right. No, I think there's a contemporary in the scope of this war issue, and there's a broader legal, what does this mean for Israel issue? And I think both of those issues in themselves have a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah. Something else that was very interesting this week is we had a lot of news to do with the Abraham Accords. Not only did Kazakhstan join, but we also had Syria making comments about whether or not they would join. And it's kind of it was a big week for the Abraham Accords.
Yeah. First of all, I'm just excited that it's been revived, because I remember when it was first announced and all the countries signed, it really felt for the first time in a very long time
something was happening.
Something's actually happening, and then just kind of fell flat. And obviously, things happen, time went on. So I'm glad that it's at least revitalized, being brought into, the public eye. I think the Kazakhstan joining is interesting. Obviously, I don't think it's like the biggest achievement of who we are trying to get to join the Abraham Accords, but nevertheless, everyone's always welcome. And I think it's interesting to see like what kind of trade and strategic deals will form as a result of it. But I think more interestingly is the topic of Syria, because the talk of the Abraham Accords was part of another historic event, which was the fact that Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara went to Washington,
Right.
which 2 years ago, I would never think that any Syrian president would be in Washington. That's like so hard to.
It's a shocking moment to
It's
see.
it's now it's just like another Tuesday, but it's so hard to like internalize. But also, it's just interesting that it's him because he's formerly a wanted terrorist by the U.S. government, and then there was a video of him playing basketball with like top military chiefs. It's just like it's just so interesting as an isolated incident to look at. But that aside, if we look at the actual talk of what he said, right? So we know Trump is like a very big purporter of the Abraham Accords. He wants as many countries to join as possible. He sees it as much of a win for him as for Israel, as someone who's really pushing this forward and is trying to get everyone. And Syria, it seems like he at least believes that they have a lot to benefit from the United States involvement, and a way to get them to get these benefits is to join the Abraham Accords, to which President Shara said, we're not just going to unilaterally join. It's not going to happen that way. We have, our grievances. We have our issues with the borders, with the Golan, previous altercations between Israel and Syria. But he did say that he's open to Trump shaping the negotiations. So it's not completely ruled out. It's not that it will never happen. And I mean, if this week showed anything, it's that really anything is possible, especially with Syria. It sounds like they're really, open to a new age. They're open to making reforms. They're open to all of these things. But we still have a way to go.
I think we're kind of at a critical time. The war is ending. I think you don't even see those things like as they're bubbling up and happening. But now, even the fact that it's on the table and the conversation is happening is something that we couldn't have imagined. And it's interesting as well, like you were talking about kind of like the contrast. I know that I think it was in a Fox News interview where al-Shara was talking about his ties with Al-Qaeda, and they asked him this question, and it's just like, you're really seeing something emerge now that is like completely different to what we could have understood, but also it might be like this modern age or like post-war or whatever it may be. Syria's gone through so much suffering, and like you can kind of see that that is a new path for them, however that's going to look. But I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and again, I don't think this is going to happen overnight. Like when he says Trump can still shape negotiations, doesn't mean within a month they're going to bang it out. But yeah, like you said, like things are, knock on wood, calming down, and I think that gives a lot of breathing room for actual negotiations to happen. And I haven't even really imagined what like in Israel with a peaceful border with Syria looks like.
It's hard to even think about.
Like I haven't dedicated thought to that yet, because why would I? But yeah, like that would be very interesting. Yeah.
But just how we've gotten used to, having a peaceful border with Egypt and with Jordan, I feel like that could be on the table, but not necessarily, obviously, as you said, it's not right now. But I think Trump, he is kind of so tunnel visioned on the sense of like making these peace plans for the Middle East, whatever. People are arguing about what the motivation of that really, really is, but regardless, he's still making those moves, and it's fascinating.
We're in the very beginning of his term. He still has 3 whole years of just relentless.
Yeah.
So
a lot has happened since.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even though the war is coming down, as we've said, it is still going on. While we're in a ceasefire, it's a rather tumultuous one with incidents here and there. We have to remember that the war isn't over.
Hostages are still
being held, as we said. Hamas is still at this moment still an armed entity within Gaza. And this week, the IDF revealed a bunch of documents that were retrieved from Gaza, revealing what I wouldn't say is really a surprise to anybody, because there's been a lot of incidents in the past, but kind of just strengthening what we already know. They released these documents showing Hamas's implicit ties with UNRWA, with Iran, and incidents involving stealing humanitarian aid meant for Gazan civilians. So I think it was Monday, but I'm not entirely sure. The IDF revealed a bunch of documents showing, UNRWA employees taking photos with Hamas terrorists. There was kind of doubles where there are Hamas terrorists who had UNRWA ID employee like cards and identification. Well-known UNRWA teachers or like heads of like departments were seen in tunnels with terrorists. And, this is an issue that has like a long history. Israel already passed a bill like banning like UNRWA, like its offices from operating within Israel and trying to shut it down for this exact reason. It's obviously met a lot of pushback because it's still, a UN organization providing crucial services and aid, but the evidence is just, at this point, increasingly overwhelming, showing their involvement. But it wasn't just UNRWA. Like, also it showed Al Jazeera, which also has been shut down multiple times within Israel for this exact same reason, for the suspicion that, they're assisting the terror org. And they also showed, Al Jazeera reporters in direct contact with Hamas terrorists, not as some kind of like expose, but like off hours, actually just, socializing with them in tunnels. They found a direct line from Hamas, like, to the Al Jazeera offices. It also very deeply detailed more production details about that documentary of Sinwar, which we covered, I don't remember how long ago it was at this point, but it shows how Sinwar himself had a very big hand in like certain productions that Al Jazeera would then broadcast.
Like, as you said, I don't think it's a surprise. I remember even like, in 2014 during Protective Edge, these kinds of claims were coming out. And I think it kind of fuels the fire of, I think a lot of times you see that no matter what comes out from like an Israeli perspective, people who are kind of anti-Israel and anti the IDF, they're not really going to believe these kinds of things. They'll say, well, we can bring the same evidence on the other side, and it almost seems to not matter. So I feel like, in a way, it doesn't even matter how much evidence you bring and how many documents you have and how many hostages come back and say, this person was working for this aid organization and they held me captive, It's a very interesting dynamic where I think that, like, we've been sort of, and we being Israel, has sort of been trying to push this for a very long time, that it's so intertwined, yet nothing is really happening.
Right.
I find that, it's like, what can you really do? How much proof can you give? It is worth sharing the proof, but what is it going to do?
Of course, yeah. I think another angle of the story, which is less explored and probably for another episode because there's just so many implications, but there's this interesting dynamic in that while obviously, the Hamas operatives are dealing with, the Al Jazeera reporters in Gaza, so it's obviously, like a localized, effort, but, Al Jazeera is a Qatari state-owned news channel, and the dynamic with Qatar is a very, I'd say, interesting and complicated one. Israel is very undecided if they're an enemy, if they're hostile,
I'm
if it's
confused,
strategic.
I want to say.
Yeah,
I feel like, yeah.
It's very complicated because, there's this channel owned by Qatar that is actively helping Hamas, who are actively fighting, but they're also mediating for this ceasefire that we're negotiating with them to put pressure on the Hamas. And again, this is why I think it's for another episode.
It's very convoluted.
But it really makes you think, just like, diplomacy is really funny. Like, I don't...
It is. And there's so many moving parts that I think, like, a lot of us just either don't see or we don't understand.
Right, of course.
But also we can't see or we can't understand. Yeah. So it's just... Yeah, I think you have to try and soak in as much information as possible. But you still have to know, maybe I don't know all of the elements here.
Yeah, and also the Qatar angle is not really a major significant part of the story, but you just, in the back of your head, you're like, what is going on? Yeah.
Right. Even though Mamdani wasn't elected this week, we've still seen, like, the after effects of his election and what Trump has been saying, and that's also been really interesting to see. He said that Mamdani, in order to be successful, needs to respect Washington. Now, there's a lot of ways you can take that. Their values and their policies are clearly very, very not aligned. And a lot of people are still reacting, and so it's a really big deal.
Yeah. We'll see. This week also Mamdani said that he will talk to Trump before he takes office, which is, I believe, in January. But in the meantime, this isn't, I don't think this is a wait and see kind of thing until he goes into office, because there's still a lot of buzz from his victory. A lot of Jews in New York have voiced to us their concerns. We have, numerous op-eds and comments from people who live there, people who left there, people who used to live there, and their thoughts and concerns about this election. Famously, we also know that, much earlier on throughout this campaign, Mamdani also said that, I think it was in one of the debates, that if Prime Minister Netanyahu showed up in New York when he was mayor, he would arrest him.
Right.
Which obviously, I don't think that's actually possible. Also, if you ask me personally, I think Bibi will try it just to see what happens. So, I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
That would be a really interesting episode of the podcast.
Yep.
If that did happen.
He'll do some time in the slammer maybe for a few hours. No.
Yeah. It's interesting also to ask why. I mean, I guess like it happens when anybody ever gets elected, but like how do you know? A lot of people say a lot of things. What they actually do is very different. You have to sort of trust them on their word and see, that's kind of the angle that they're going to go to. But a lot of times they're saying it in order to get support and like they want to get the votes. When they're actually in office, how that looks and the restrictions they're actually on that makes it look very different.
Yeah, and another thing, like this, again, this is kind of like a side thought, not the main point of the story, but it's just really interesting to see how, like, an election for the mayor of a city made so much buzz and has all these huge implications. Like, if I think about, who's running for the mayor of Ramat Gan, I can't tell you how much I personally don't care, like how much it doesn't affect my life or how it has the potential to affect my life, and like this has turned into like this thing, and it's just
phenomenon.
It's really incredible. So I don't think this is the last we'll hear of the Trump-Mamdani clash until, he takes office, but, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. And a last thing that is a little bit more positive is that Gal Gadot is going to receive the Genesis Prize for 2026. And there's many reasons why they want to give her the prize, but it's mainly about the fact that she stood sort of in the face of the world against anti-Semitism after October 7th. And I think something that is even more like, it's kind of like a step above that. She said that the $1 million prize that she would get, she would then invest in sort of like rehabilitation NGOs and things like that for people who have suffered from the war and in general. And I think that's just something positive to celebrate, something nice.
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone better for it to go to. The Genesis Prize, they call it the Jewish Nobel Prize. Gal Gadot this whole time throughout the war has been unapologetic every single time. I think what's really interesting is that she didn't do some kind of trade-off. I feel like a lot of people either don't speak out because they don't want it to affect their careers, or they kind of take a pause from the career. Either the career is kind of tanking, so they need something, so they turn into like an activist. And, Gal Gadot very much, she continued her work. She continued acting throughout this entire time. She's continued making movies this entire time. So she hasn't, taken a break to like make activism her only thing. But at the same time, she never stopped posting. When she was back in Israel, she met with the hostage families, and this was obviously before their loved ones were returned. Super vocal on all of her social media, just never letting the hostages leave the spotlight, of at least her, like where she could influence.
Also, hopefully it will inspire people. I think we're coming like to a point now where, people might be afraid to try and be successful, like in the international space, if they know that they're Jewish or Israeli, because they know they're going to be targeted. And I think what she's doing is kind of saying, okay, I'm unapologetically Jewish. The way that I conduct myself, is who I am as an Israeli. But she doesn't like start villainizing everybody else either.
She's like, this is me. If you hate me,
that's fine. But then she still like gets her job. She does her things, and I think like that's inspirational for anybody who wants to try and get a leg up and be successful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Really. So thank you for joining for this week's Top Stories.
Thank you for having me.
And now for something a little more unusual. U.S. President Donald Trump formally requested that Israeli President Isaac Herzog give a presidential pardon to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for his corruption trial. This is obviously an unusual move, sparked a lot of political reactions, a lot of legal backlash, and questions about who really makes policy decisions in Israel. To explore this further, we're joined with our legal correspondent, Sarah Ben-Nun. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Jay. Good to be back.
Thank you. So,
what's going on?
I think Trump really likes sending letters. Let's talk about it. So first, I would like to say what actually does... There's a few questions here, right? What does the letter actually literally say? What are the legal implications of, pardoning or like legal requirements, and does the letter meet it? Like, let's start there.
Okay, so the letter says several things. The letter has several like basic elements to it. The first is Trump establishing kind of his close relationship and friendship with Herzog. But I'm not going in order of the letter. I'm going in order of how I read like the tiers that the letter builds. You have, we're such good friends. We have a relationship. It came to expression when I came to Israel and I spoke in the Knesset.
The best legal argument.
You and I are good friends. We start there. That establishes like the personal connection. Then he says, Bibi, your prime minister, has led us to, amazing feats, knocking down Iran, keeping Hamas in check, which if I recall the quote correctly, I think that is exactly how he writes it. Basically saying Netanyahu has done historic things in a historic battlefield, historic neighborhood, right, where we are right now in the Middle East. So he kind of says that's setting the stage, and then saying the only way to complete this kind of sense of unity is to consider pardoning the prime minister. That's kind of like how I saw the structure of the letter. I will say parenthetically that a couple of weeks ago, when several ministers, most of them from the Likud, wrote a letter to Herzog asking for the same thing, the structure, like as soon as I read the letter yesterday, I was like, oh, this is basically the same letter
okay.
with a few different touches to different people, but the arguments are the same, right?
Okay.
Bibi broke the Iranian access, led us to amazing things, like these are, the whole world is looking at Israel, but we are in a complete societal split. And it's getting deeper and deeper, and it's worse. And the cause is the trial,
right?
The indictment and the trial that's really dragged on for 5 years now, and it's still going on. So that is just something that I do think is important to keep an eye on, because people forget, our memory is very short.
Right. So before I go into like Israeli law and how this works, I have to ask, the fact that this is a official letter from the U.S. president, and not him, saying it as like voicing his opinion or like talking to reporters on Air Force One, like he's actually sending an official document, independent of like whatever legal arguments may be in the letters. The fact that this comes from like an official formal request from the U.S. president change or add anything to its weight of legality for like Israel to consider?
I would say hard legalities, no. Soft legalities, absolutely. Okay. Right. It's a step up in the pressure, right? Because first, let's timeline it. First, you had several like social media posts. Let's go back before Trump posted those. Actually, what
Sure.
did you have? You had half the country saying our prime minister is dysfunctional, and we see that through 4 election cycles, and the complete blindsidedness of October 7th and mismanagement of the war that followed, hostages, soldiers dying, etc. Not all due to the trial, but it definitely affects it, right? You can't have, even if you're Netanyahu and you're probably one of the smartest people in the world, you still can't fully, manage things in a clear way when you are also in a corruption trial, right? We saw
repeated incidents where they had to like ask for it to be delayed, or only 2 times a week for 3 times a week.
This happens every week, right? Yeah. So that was like one half of the country, and the other half of the country said it's completely fabricated. The cases are empty. Let him just do his job. He knows his job of being, Mr. Security and protecting Israel. That is a job he knows how to do. So you had like these two kind of, I'm generalizing greatly, but like those two basic stances within Israeli society. And then Trump kind of burst into that. And it started with social media posts, right, saying that Bibi's being persecuted, and the trial is not valid, and he's a war hero and things like that. Then a few weeks ago you had, and those were over the last several months.
Right.
A few weeks ago, you had a letter.
I might be making this up, but I feel like every time he mentioned the Bibi trial, it was also like in correlation of
what he experienced.
Instances of, no, that too, of course, but also I feel like every time he mentioned it, there's always instances of like U.S. Israeli like working together, whether it be like ceasefire pressures or like military operations.
Definitely, no, and that's part of the arguments. Like Israel's
been
very.
Yeah. So one looking off the side would make it seem that a bunch of Israel's actions were dependent on U.S. actions towards Israel would be dependent on Trump asking for a pardon after.
I don't know if I would condition it so much, but he definitely does lay into that partnership element of, Israel is a partner of the U.S. He doesn't say this, but that's the undertone in like this great war against this, an evil regime.
Right. There's also obviously the element of
in that
Trump.
Grand fight, like, really, are you really gonna pressure him over Bugs Bunny and cigars and champagne, right? So that's kind of the tone.
Yeah. And there's, as you said, there's also a parallel with what's going on in America. The whole 2020 election. Sarah Netanyahu spoke on Fox News about the deep state, both in Israel and America. Like it's
No, there's definitely
It's a lot,
a media like advisory sheet going around, like right, they're all saying the same things, but right. So then you had the letter by the Likud ministers a few weeks ago, and then
and of course we can't
have this
forget.
letter.
Hold on, we can't forget Trump's speech in Knesset.
Trump's speech in the Knesset.
When
and
he visited Israel.
Also, I remembered this now when a few months ago, Ambassador Mike Huckabee came to the trial and kind of visited, and I remember at one point, and I don't know if I'm making this up, but this is what I recall, where he was asked about it, right, by reporters and everyone in the room, and he said, well, I'm like an ordinary citizen coming to a public trial, and you're not, right? Like you're Trump's representative to the state, and so you coming here sends a message, and it aligns with like everything else, right? And he even tweeted afterwards, I believe, right? Like, I went and I saw, and like I agree now that this is all.
So now he sent the letter. After this culmination of this build up, the letter has now been sent. Let's talk about Israeli law and like legal procedures, like legal protocol. So like, what is a pardon? How does one receive a pardon? What are the requirements for one to receive a pardon? And like, how would this potentially fill those?
So the answer is that it can't.
Okay.
Really, the answer is that it can't, and that's for two kind of general reasons. The presidential pardon, first of all, is rare. Let's start with the basis. The basis is that your legal system is just and thorough, and that you can rely on it to exact justice.
Right.
A pardon comes in when you feel that there was a miscarriage of that the justice system kind of failed on itself, and they are granted. There are pardons granted every year. I think Yom Ha'atzmaut, something around then. Like, you have several presidential pardons that come out. A pardon cannot be issued in the middle of a criminal, in the middle of like criminal legal proceedings, which is where we are right now. It has to be either before they start or after you have a verdict. And then once you have a verdict, you can come to the president and say, hey, this verdict is unjust. Consider a pardon.
So even if he wants to, let's say Herzog wanted to, he can't until the current trial ends.
This is not the time frame during which it can be granted.
Okay.
And I'll remind us that we're in the middle of cross-examination by the prosecution. You mentioned this earlier, but due to scheduling conflicts and everything that's been going on, the schedule for the testimony hearings is 3 days a week, but they are often not 3 full days a week from 9:30 to 4. It's usually either cut off early or canceled. And again, like, it makes sense with the schedule, but when the judges said, we want to push this along, I can understand why they said that when they get, the hearings get trimmed from all ends.
So obviously we can't say when we think the trial's going to end, but like, it's very
no. So
long.
Now we're in cross-examination. They just finished, they're going to finish the questioning on case 1000 early next week on Monday already, and then you have 2 more cases. Now, case 4000 is kind of the largest and the heaviest, so I estimate that will take much longer.
We got a while to go.
We have a while to go, and then you need time for the verdict, and we're talking about a long time frame.
In which a pardon cannot be given.
A pardon cannot be given. The other condition for a pardon is that the request has to come from either the defendant or someone like close to the defendant. It can't be given from the top down. It can't be. The president can't come and
request a pardon before Bibi.
Like Bibi
or his whatever has to request it themselves.
Exactly, and Bibi has said and has hinted that he's not going to issue such a request.
Right. So that means that legally Herzog doesn't have to. If a actual formal request comes from Bibi or someone close to him, then he can consider it and take it into account.
Exactly.
But this letter in of itself shouldn't spark any sort of official process. It can't. Okay.
And the president's office did put out an announcement like pretty soon right after where they said all of those things. They said, we appreciate and we recognize, and at the same time, we have regulations for pardoning. And if a pardon is to be issued, it has to follow those protocols. So they were pretty clear on that as well. I do think it's important to mention also that I believe twice over the past several years there have been mediation attempts to come to a plea bargain. One came from the judges after the indictment was issued. Another was, surfaced a few months ago that a couple of years ago, former Supreme Court Chief President Aaron Barak was kind of the figure who sat with the two sides and sought and tried to check how we can come to a plea deal. And the thing that kind of stumped it both times is the issue of moral turpitude. Moral turpitude is kind of the charge that Netanyahu would have to accept. That would basically say, right, I acted immorally in the position that I was publicly elected to. And so I will retreat from politics for X amount of years. This is what happened with Aryeh Deri back in the early 2000s. He was out of politics for a while, and then just a couple of years ago, right, he came back. That's moral turpitude, and that's what Netanyahu would kind of have to sign off on, and he won't, because I'm estimating that it's due to several reasons. For me, the first reason is age. First of all,
as in if he does accept that charge,
if he accepts that now,
he won't come back.
He won't come back to politics. I'm sure it's also kind of
we can speculate legacy,
a pride thing, legacy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like there's a lot of reasons why I can imagine he would say no to something like that, but that is chiefly why. Also, the prosecution has kind of insisted on keeping certain charges in, and
both sides don't want it because very different reasons.
The gap is pretty large between both sides.
Right.
So those efforts failed. So that's why we're where we're at today. And I guess we just have to, wait and see for now. Like there isn't much else to do, just to keep going with the trial.
So I think legally that clears a lot of stuff up. Thank you. Because I think, people are saying this can't happen and people are insisting it can happen. And, the law is very clear. So it's good to just have some
also
actual...
when the Likud letter came out, everyone was like, Herzog has to do something. And I just thought it was funny because I was like, well, these ministers, they know the law.
Yeah.
Like they know this can happen. So it was funny. It was like a little
interesting to see.
A little concerning for me to see how people just kind of took what they said.
Acquainted with the law will tell you it doesn't
quickly. Yeah. So that was a little concerning, but
listen, it's not surprising, but it is definitely concerning. Another interesting element of this whole story that we haven't delved into yet, because the legal every time you're on, the legal set the record straight is very important, because without that it's impossible to really draw your own conclusions. But that aside, so now we understand this letter doesn't have any legal weight whatsoever. Maybe it'll be considered in the future if an official pardon comes, request comes from Bibi. But until then, it was just a gesture. But another interesting element, less related to legal clauses now, that I really want to explore, because I think it's a very interesting development, is this question of who's really our prime minister. It's how much sway does the U.S. have in Israel? I know that sounds...
We do have to talk about this.
I know it sounds ridiculous, but
I think,
we have we have the CENTCOM Center in Kiryat Gat. We have him interfering in our internal politics now. There's already been snap polls about how people feel about this, and a lot of people are really disconcerted that essentially the de facto prime minister is the U.S. representative at the time, who's really kind of saying how things are going to go, whether this be about security, whether this be about internal policy. We saw hints of this when Witkoff and Kushner were in Israel after kind of securing the deal, and people really look up to them for guidance and about what's going to come next. And then in that same breath, when they mentioned Bibi, everyone was just booing. And so it's obviously I'm not saying that the U.S. controls Israel. That's not what I'm saying. But the scope of influence that we're seeing from the U.S. on internal Israeli policy and security decisions is, I would say, at the very least, very interesting and different than in the past. Obviously, the U.S. has always had its opinions, and we've always listened, and we've always considered what they want, because we are very close allies. You almost never really have true unilateral security decisions without any kind of consultants. But I think what we're seeing now is a new level.
I do think it's really interesting to think about this stuff. As you were speaking, I kind of thought of more historical examples.
I'm not saying this is the first time, by no means.
This is not the first time, and it's an interesting, tense at times and fruitful at others relationship right between one of the world's greatest superpowers today and this tiny little Jewish state, right, the size of what is it? New Jersey?
New Jersey.
New Jersey, right? It's definitely swayed back and forth over the years. And I guess what I wonder now is whether we are actually seeing an escalation, as you suggested, or if it's more of what we have already known is more just coming to light.
Interesting.
That it's more on the surface. Personally, I think it's insane that there is this attempt to intervene in an internal sovereign criminal trial, as ridiculous as you might think it is. And I do think that there is room to claim. I don't think this, but I don't.
There's an argument to be made.
There is an argument to be made. I think if you actually delve into the indictment, and you look, like, I do think there are ways to argue that it is a little overblown, but I don't think that justifies a breaking into this bubble of sovereignty that is actually quite dangerous from the sense of a state wants to ensure that its sovereignty is ironclad and that it's protected in this way. And I think one thing also that I can't ever shake with what's been going on lately is also that elections are coming up, that Likud elections are coming up. Trump's letter is going to echo with voters.
Right.
And with people who already think that the trial is a sham. And there are a lot of people like that. So you're also, I think it carries on several different levels, and we have to keep all of those in mind. Like, we have to keep elections in mind when we talk about this.
Oh, yeah, of course.
We can't, put that aside, right?
One thing that I think concerns me is that, as we've said, this isn't the first time that Trump has commented on Bibi's trial.
Right.
But, the last time he posted on Truth Social that, this is an unfair trial and, they're chasing him out of nothing and et cetera, et cetera. At the time when that happened, I don't remember exactly when that was because, this war has been going on for so long. So I don't remember.
Several months ago.
It was a few months ago.
Yeah.
And at the time when that came out, the responses were very, thank you, but, we have our own internal politics.
I would say also especially from the opposition.
Not even from the opposition, even people from the coalition. A lot of people were very we respect you, thank you, we agree with you, Israel will deal with Israel. And now, this time, a lot of people in the government were just, thank you, Trump, listen to Trump, Herzog, listen to Trump. There was no pushback. I don't care about sovereignty anymore. Listen to Trump.
I think that's watching in live action the shifting of the goalposts.
Yes. And listen, we'll see.
And elections again.
Yeah. Listen, we'll see. It might start and end here. In a few weeks, we might have Trump socialing about how Israel should do something with its trade. I don't know. We'll see. It's just.
We'll have to see. I mean, I think that the foundations of Israel's democracy, as much as they're getting shaken right now, and I do believe that they're being shaken in unprecedented ways, I think that they are still quite strong. And I think we need to also take, we need to remember that it's a theater, what we're watching, everything that's unfolding. Of
course. Yeah.
It's a theater. It doesn't, like we said, it's not going to happen until a request comes in. Or there are regulations that you can't get around. Right.
By the time it's even relevant, the next thing will already have happened.
The clock moves fast in Washington and in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so it's concerning and interesting at the very least. But I do think that the foundations are still there, and we can be a little bit less terrified.
All right, well, if that's your take, I'm relieved. You're the expert. So. All right, so I guess we'll leave it at that, and we'll see what the next few months hold in store, and if that progresses in any way.
Thank you, Jay.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Our next segment is the deep dive, where we take one story from this week and analyze it in a little more depth. This week, Hamas returned deceased hostage Lieutenant Hadar Goldin, who was killed and kidnapped in 2014 in Operation Protective Edge. Was returned to Israel, where he was buried in Kfar Saba. In order to explore this in more detail and explain why this whole process took place after 11 whole years, we're joined by Ruth Eglash, the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report, who's also been covering Gaza extensively and was also covering the news on the day that Hadar was kidnapped. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So first, I want to talk about just kind of the baseline events as they happened this week, what happened, just so we could start there in case people aren't so familiar with the story. So Hadar Goldin was, was part of the comprehensive ceasefire deal to have his body returned as part of the ceasefire now between Israel and Hamas. Obviously, at the time of recording, there are still 4 hostages whose bodies remain in Gaza, who we are waiting for their return from Hamas, but his bodies will return this week. Notably, he was not killed and kidnapped in this war, as opposed to most of the hostages. He was killed and kidnapped 11 years ago. So how did we really get to this point?
Well, I think most people were shocked on Saturday when they heard that Hamas, or there was rumors flying around that Hamas had found the body of Hadar Goldin, because 11 years, I mean, that's a long time.
It's a very long time.
Most people thought, maybe they wouldn't find his remains, maybe they wouldn't hand him over because he's not part of this war, and it was his story started way before this.
Right.
But
it almost seems like a different effort. There was the effort to bring them home, and then there was
And I think in the international media there is a distinction. As Israelis always counted him among the hostages from the very first days of the wars. Whereas international media, and I know because I was, up until a few months ago, was working in the international media, he was not counted as one of the hostages from this war.
Really?
Yeah.
So when they said the amount, is this why we would see approximately 250 hostages? Because
that's why the numbers were sometimes confusing.
Interesting.
Anyway, but when we heard this week that his body had been found and he was going to be returned to Israel, I think people, especially people who remember what happened in 2014, on August 1st, 2014, which was the day he was taken, they were very surprised. And I think that's why we saw so many people turning out for his funeral, because his is a story that people have watched and followed. And sometimes when you have big numbers, 250 hostages, it's harder to connect with stories than when you have one story.
Right.
And Hadar Goldin is one story that people have followed.
It's a story that people have grown up with.
People have grown up with, people have followed, and people just didn't expect that there would be a resolution to this story. They didn't
that it would
know.
come now.
That it would come now.
So I want to go back to 2014, because I think since so much has happened in the past 2 years, and really so much just keeps happening, it's kind of hard to drown that out and really understand, how did this all start? Because for me personally, I don't vaguely remember when it happened. I think, I was checked out at the time because earlier that summer was obviously, there was the war, there was the operation, and I was working at summer camp at the time, and there were Israelis who were working alongside us, and it got to a point where just, every day someone would get a phone call or a text that one of their friends was killed in Gaza. So I think at that point I was mentally checked out, and I really, I honestly can't say I remember the day that he was kidnapped. So can you kind of remind us what happened, what state of the war, ceasefire we were, what was going on?
So it was a very dramatic day, actually, of that summer. That summer, as many of you might know, it started when 3 Israeli teens were kidnapped by members of Hamas next to Hebron, and their bodies were found 2 weeks later. There was a massive manhunt around that area. Everyone was following it and trying to, see what was going on with the 3 Israeli teens. And once their bodies were found, I think within a week, war broke out in Gaza. And it was the first time, because there'd been many flare-ups between Israel and Hamas leading up to that point, but it was the first time that troops actually ground troops went inside Gaza and were fighting on the ground there. And there were a few different battles that people remember from that war. And on August 1st, after I think it was 2 weeks of fighting, or 1 or 2 weeks of fighting, Israel and Hamas reached Hudna, or a ceasefire. And everyone was hopeful that it would be the end of the war. And as a journalist then, and I was working for the Washington Post, I was invited by the army to go on an embed, to join them with the Navy, to view Gaza from the coastline, and to talk about the maritime challenges that had come up during that war, because it was the first time that it was revealed that Hamas had a Navy unit, a small Navy unit that had infiltrated a couple of times the beach in Zikim, which is right next to the northern part of the Gaza Strip. So they invited us to Ashdod port. We got on a Navy boat, and we went out into the sea, and it was supposed to be quiet because there was supposed to be a ceasefire. And we could hear from the sea artillery fire and explosions. And I remember talking to other journalists saying, okay, that's weird because it's supposed to be quiet.
Right.
It's not supposed to be happening. And obviously we didn't have access to our phones or anything like that because we were out at sea. And
was it clear that, something bad was happening? Or because, sometimes even in ceasefires, it'll be like, we'll destroy a tunnel, like the IDF will destroy a tunnel, or we'll notice something a bit zeh.
I
So
think
it's like,
there's always that first day of the ceasefire when you're not sure if it's going to hold. And,
Right.
we've been covering it extensively. I mean, I had been working like 14, 15-hour days covering it for the Washington Post. And so I was like, okay, now maybe I can relax. But like, is it going to hold? Is it going to stay? Is someone going to break it? What's going to happen? So even as I got on the boat, I remember like feeling uneasy, like
Right.
maybe this wouldn't hold. And then when I heard like explosions and artillery fire, and I think maybe we kind of assumed there was rocket fire. We couldn't see from that far away, but like it sounded like rocket fire. So we kind of were worried that there wouldn't be that the ceasefire, those hours while we were on the boat was not holding. And then obviously when we came back to shore and we checked our phones and we saw what had happened, we realized that there'd been some kind of event. And it was only later, I think in the day, that we found out that three soldiers had been killed and one of their bodies had been taken into the tunnel. And it became also like the story became very interesting because Israel apparently issued the Hannibal Directive, which meant that they weren't going to go in and rescue him, which became very controversial. And there was a lot of, reports on that afterwards.
And essentially that operation transformed.
Yes.
In that moment.
Yeah.
It became a quasi-hostage situation.
Yeah.
It reminds us of, like the Shalit deal.
Right.
I think it would be, naive to say that Israeli society hasn't fully, I would say, not recovered, but like digested the Shalit deal. Again, it's such a dilemma that has, societal splits in Israel like to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in very Israeli fashion, before even we're done processing the first thing, the next thing already happens, and then the next thing already happens. Yeah. And I think that
I think the issue of hostages is so very sensitive, especially soldiers, because, everyone is a soldier in Israel. Everyone has a son or brother or a father who is a soldier, because it's the people's army. It's conscription, right?
Absolutely.
Everyone has to serve. So, everyone feels connected to these soldiers, and they think, well, if it happened to Gilad Shalit or Hadar Goldin, it could happen to my son or my father or my brother. So, everyone and everyone understands the dilemma that it puts Israel in, because we saw it with the Shalit deal. For 5 years, his family protested and demonstrated and traveled the world and, did everything they could to raise awareness to the fact that he was being held in Gaza. And eventually he was released in exchange for more than 1,000 Hamas and other terrorist fighters or militants. And there was lots of protests during that period of time before Shalit was released. And I think that Hadar Goldin's story also put everyone back into that dilemma. And many people felt very, strongly, very supportive of the Goldin family and obviously felt identified with them, because it could have been their son, could have been their husband, their brother. His story was slightly different because it was confirmed very early on that he had been killed.
Right.
And that he wasn't alive. So I want to say that people kind of were less pressured to bring him back, and that's maybe why there was so much shock this week when he was returned, because the pressure wasn't as high as if he had been alive.
Yeah, I think it's like it's sad to say. I think a lot of people might have written it off as if it's just not really going to happen ever, because especially after 11 years.
Yeah.
And the current war, obviously everything is connected because Hamas has been planning this for years, et cetera, but like I think you don't directly see the link between this current war and like previous operations, and like it's just kind of hard to like digest that like this is how we ended up coming home, because it feels like so
it feels not connected.
Yeah.
But then I think immediately after October 7th, or within the early days after October 7th, and when we started becoming clear that so many people had been taken hostages, I think that the Goldin family kind of stepped in, and they were not only that, everyone included them amongst the hostages, but they offered their experience of the last, by then it was 9 years, 2 years ago, it was 9 years. They offered their experiences and their connections and they were kind of, I guess, the families of the hostages from this war looked at what the Goldins did, because Leah and Simcha Goldin, especially in the early years, they traveled the world, they met with world leaders, they spoke at the UN, they spoke to all the media, and I interviewed Leah Goldin about 2 years after Operation Protective Edge, and I did a story about this battle of holding bodies, like what it means. Also, because Israel holds onto the bodies of Palestinian terrorists for not for ransom, but for to send a message to the Palestinians to stop them either from celebrating the return of martyrs, or to have some sort of power,
it's like deterrence, kind of.
A deterrence. And on the other side, they held on to Hadar Goldin's body as a way to bring exchange him for Palestinian
it's multifaceted. There's obviously the exchange element and the kind of leverage, because obviously we really it's very important to us to get our bodies back so we can give them a proper burial. I would argue, obviously, there's an element of it's like the essence of cruelty, as in they want to have that kind of effect on us and that torture over us. I want to talk more about Goldin's family, because you've talked to them extensively, and I really think their efforts, because it's over a span of 9 years, it's hard to focus the magnitude of the influence that I think they have on not just the hostage families, but Israeli society. I think they changed how Israel's views on bringing back all hostages home, no matter what condition they're in. And it's really interesting, because the Hostage Families Forum began at the beginning of this war in a very interesting way. This grassroots civilian effort. It eventually became the organized thing it was now. But I remember that first press conference they had, where they just had a few parents who just a few days ago realized that their loved ones were kidnapped into Gaza, which is a hard reality to grasp with. And a lot of what you already said about the Goldin family, I can already visualize it being reflected. Them meeting with world leaders, them talking to the UN, taking shifts, not stopping, talking to the media. I really don't think there's been a single day in the past 2 years that there hasn't been media interviews and a press release and a rally and every kind of other initiative. And they've funded their own reports. And I really think a lot of that comes from the Goldin family showing the way and how it's done. So, I mean, we saw the funeral this week. We saw what it meant to them. We saw, we heard what they had to say, but I'd love to hear more about this entire process, throughout this 11-year process, what...
Well, I think that, I think you said, everything you said is absolutely right. But I also believe that it sheds a light on the dilemma that Israel and the Israelis face in this kind of situation, or that anyone faces in this kind of situation, and particularly over the last 2 years, because we talk about leverage, but part of the leverage is that it's a very divisive issue.
Right.
And we saw that even with the hostages from the last 2 years, because there was a small group of relatives of hostages, the Tikva Forum, who said that war has to keep on going, and even at the cost of getting our loved ones back, the war has to keep on going because we have to end this.
And it wasn't even that divide. There were also people in the middle saying it has to be a complete deal. There was no partial deals, and you had even relatives of hostages said even a partial deal we should take for at least this time. So it's very layered. It's a very...
Yeah, and I know that a lot of the hostages' families from the last 2 years were, in the beginning at least, very nervous about speaking out, because they thought it might make the situation worse for their loved ones who are being held in Gaza. It might mean prolonging the situation, and it might mean that their loved ones were the last ones to come back. And I know that many people said that about Einav Zangauka and Matan Zangauka, that because she was so vocal and because she was so prominent, that he would be the last person to come back.
And I'm sure it's even more terrifying when you have a precedent of Gilad Shalit and Hadar Goldin and Oren Shaul, where it's just years of...
Yeah.
If your reality is up until this point, a hostage in Gaza stays there for multiple years, if not over it,
I mean, even more than that, you have the hostages who were released a few months ago, who had also been held for more than 10 years. The Avera Mengistu and
Hisham al-Sayed.
Al-Sayed.
Well, also a lot of people similar. Obviously, it's a different dilemma in and of itself, but I think a lot of people kind of just assumed, like, it's been over a decade, it's not happening.
Right. I mean, when I saw them coming out, I interviewed Avera Mengistu's family. I did quite an in-depth story about them a few years ago, and when I saw him walking out of Gaza, I was shocked.
It was unreal.
I was shocked that he was standing, that he was alive, that it was, I felt like that with many of the hostages, because we've been covering
of course,
their stories so closely, and you see them coming out. And not that long ago, I spoke to Eli Sharabi, and it's like, this poster, this picture is coming alive. But it was even more, it felt even more amazing when you saw people after 10 years. And I think many people felt that about Hadar Goldin, also because the Goldin family were so active and so articulate and so unrelenting about bringing him back. And Leah Goldin was very, very vocal, and she, took on Netanyahu every chance she could, reminded him that, this agreement that Israelis have with their government when they send their children into the army.
Right.
And I think that is, like, in a nutshell, that's the point. Like, if you are a parent and you're sending your child into the army, or someone goes into the army as a soldier, the agreement with the state is that if they are kidnapped or kept behind enemy lines, whether they are alive or dead,
it's on you to return them.
Government will do everything they can to bring them back.
As we wrap up, I just want to hear more about, like, who Hadar Goldin was. I think we hear a lot about what happened to him in the context of the war and, these bigger discussions. And, we don't really hear so much about, what the kind of person he was. So, like, I would love more insights into, who he was as a person, and, like, kind of end on that note.
So, what I always found fascinating about him, first of all, he was a twin, and his brother was there, I think on the Kesher, on the connection, a radio,
on the radio in it,
with him on that day. So I know that's always been very interesting. But I know also that he was a very artistic young man. He was very creative. He was very involved with his family, and also he had just got engaged 2 days before he was killed. From what I've read, the last time his family saw him or spoke to him was just a few days before that event. His fiance, who moved on and married someone else, his fiance spoke at the funeral this week. And his kind of, he was a gentle soul and creative soul.
Wow, no, it's unbelievable. And so I think we can just leave up by saying that, finally, after 11 years, and to the surprise of many, I think it's nice that while, we're still watching the current war as it's unfolding, hoping that the ceasefire lasts, not forgetting the other 4 hostages for a moment, I just think that we have this relief that, at least this chapter of Operation Protective Edge, we could actually finally come to a conclusion and close that chapter.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Welcome.
That's all for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you back next week. But until then, you can keep up with the most important stories at JPost.com.